All right, we're back with part 2 of this lecture, and we just got finished with talking about the various muscles that control the actions of the arytenoid cartilages in your larynx. And now we want to think a little bit about what consequences the actions of those muscles have. We talked about them in terms of whether or not they can adduct or bring together the vocal folds, or abduct or pull apart the vocal folds. You can think about those forces more abstractly in terms of what is called adductive tension in the glottis, which is basically the tension towards the midline of your body, how much you're going to press the vocal folds together versus pulling them apart. Adductive tension, you can increase that force by using your lateral cricoarytenoid muscles or your transverse arytenoid muscles. And you can decrease it by activating your posterior cricoarytenoid muscles or pulling them apart through contracting that muscle. Adduction versus abduction will determine whether or not voicing will occur. If they're together, you can get voicing. If they're pulled apart, you're probably not going to get voicing. You get voicelessness instead. But it turns out you can do more than just bring together or pull apart your vocal folds. On top of that, I think hopefully as we know by now, you can also control the rate at which they vibrate. How do you control F0 in speech? In class, we'll often ask this question: why do women have a higher F0 than men? And hopefully you still remember the answer, because I'm not going to wait for you to answer it right now, because you're not even watching this while I'm speaking. So hopefully you recall that one of the reasons that was given is that women tend to have shorter vocal folds than men. And we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about like the angle of the thyroid cartilage and how much length there is in there for the vocal folds to fill in, basically. So women have shorter vocal folds, and because they're shorter, they can open and close more quickly, or at least you can think of this in terms of they have smaller vocal folds. In men, we can kind of look at some of the stats here. The ligamental glottis for men is about 15.5 millimeters on average. The cartilaginous glottis is about half of that. And if you add the two together, you get a total glottis length of about 23 millimeters, or that's about an inch, which is 25.4 millimeters all told. In women, the ligamental glottis is noticeably shorter, so it's 11.5 millimeters. And again, the cartilaginous glottis is about half that in length. And you add those two together, you get a total glottis length of about 17 millimeters, or about three quarters of an inch, as it were. Okay, so female vocal folds will tend to be shorter. And if you go to kids, their vocal folds are going to be shorter still. But there's more going on here. So F0 is also going to depend on what's called the longitudinal tension in the vocal folds. So longitudinal tension, we talked already about adductive tension, which is labeled as AT here, which is the force towards the midline of your larynx. Longitudinal tension is in this dimension. So how much tension or force is there stretching the vocal folds lengthwise, which is where this word comes from. Longitudinal means lengthwise, right? Like longitude on a map. Okay, so how much tension is there along the length of the vocal folds between the thyroid and arytenoid cartilages? The way this translates into F0 is that the higher tension is going to give you higher F0, and lower tension is going to give you lower F0. And maybe a way to think about this is if you've ever played a stringed instrument, like the guitar or the violin or what have you, you can think about tuning the instrument. If you tighten up the tension on the tuning knob, that pitch of that string is going to get higher. Just like if you do the same thing with your vocal folds, the F0 or the pitch of your voice is going to go up. If you slacken the tension on that string or those vocal folds, the fundamental frequency at which it vibrates will go down. Yeah, that's basically the mechanics of how it works, and hopefully that makes sense. We should think for a moment about how do we change the longitudinal tension in the larynx. I often ask this question and wait for an answer in class, even though I have no reason to expect that you will know the answer, because this is a technical thing that most people aren't going to know a priori. So it turns out you can rotate the thyroid cartilage up and down on its connection with the cricoid cartilage. And the analogy which is given for this is that it's sort of like the visor of a knight's helmet back in the old days. So yeah, you can kind of think of this, you're rocking this big old structure. It links up here. We talked about that a while back at this sort of lower facet of the cricoid cartilage. If you are pushing it forward like this, you're increasing the tension on the vocal folds by kind of stretching them out a little bit. And if you rock it back, that slackens that tension, so you're going to get lower F0 in this case because it's pushing backwards, and this distance is not quite as long. Yeah, so you either stretch or relax the vocal folds, either tighten that tuning knob or, lower it somehow, and that changes your F0. And since I mentioned this in a couple of different ways, I'll kind of try to walk you through what might seem to be a paradox here. It's not contradictory, it's just complicated. So lengthening the vocal folds results in higher longitudinal tension. Stretching them out will make them longer, and that'll give you higher F0, primarily because the tension is higher. So they're able to vibrate more because there's basically more quickly because there's less slack along their length. Shortening the vocal folds will result in less tension, and that gives you lower F0. So before I said that women have shorter vocal folds, and that's a reason why their F0 tends to be higher than men's. And now I'm telling you that if you lengthen your vocal folds, that will give you higher F0. You have to understand these lengthening and shortening effects based on sort of the default range of F0 that you would get for men versus women. So overall, women will have a higher F0 range, and then you can tweak it a little bit based on how much tension you have in the vocal folds. Men will have, on average, a lower F0 range, primarily because in part because their vocal folds are longer, and also because their vocal folds are going to be thicker. So they're just overall just a little bit bigger, and the thicker things are going to vibrate at a lower frequency than the thinner things. You can also, if you've played a stringed instrument, you probably as well know that the strings that vibrate at lower notes tend to be thicker as well, and not just longer, right? Okay, it's the contraction of what is called the cricothyroid muscle that pulls down the thyroid cartilage, and the cricothyroid muscle is here as named. It's right between the cricoid cartilage and the thyroid cartilage, so it sits down at the bottom of this thing. I don't know exactly where, but somewhere around here. And that's what gets you this action of pulling this whole thing forward or pushing it back up, basically. So when I was in grad school, I was not really interested in this line of research, but other people who worked in the lab that I was a part of were interested in this. And so some of them actually participated in studies where you could look at the activity of the cricothyroid muscle using EMG, sort of sticking that little needle in the middle of your neck while you speak, which is kind of spectacular, talking about sacrifices we make for science. So that leads me into this little passage about how you can, some other work you can do with your throat if you want to study it scientifically. This is from one of Peter Ladefoged's texts, where he talks about how to measure air pressure, or what's called subglottal air pressure, which is how much air pressure you have in your trachea before the air gets into your vocal folds and is, perturbed by the action of whatever you're doing with your larynx. So this is useful to know because air pressure or airflow is one of the factors that feeds into the level of F0, right? So we've talked about this with respiration, that if you increase airflow, you tend to get higher F0. You can also tweak the longitudinal tension in your vocal folds to raise or lower F0 as well. If you want to try to figure out independently how those two things work together, you should probably get a measure of subglottal air pressure, and then also like a measure of what your cricothyroid muscle is doing at the same time. So in this section or passage from Peter Ladefoged's book, he says to record the pressure of the air associated with stressed as opposed to unstressed syllables, we need to record the pressure below the vocal folds. A true recording of the subglottal pressure can be made only by making a tracheal puncture, so poking a hole through your throat. This is a procedure that must be performed by a physician. A local anesthetic is applied both externally and inside the trachea by means of a fine needle. A larger needle with an internal diameter of 2 millimeters can then be inserted between the rings of the trachea as shown in figure 3.3. And here's figure 3.3 from the same textbook. Isn't that spectacular? And as he says, as you can see from my face, it is not at all painful, but it is not a procedure that can be carried out in fieldwork situations. Yeah, so you want to make sure. So the friends I had back in grad school who had participated in studies like this said that you actually kind of need to have somebody on hand to give you a tracheotomy in case things go awry, which is why the medical professional has to get involved. Yeah, so if you are really interested in that sort of thing, you can get involved with it, but I never participated myself. So, yeah. Anyways, that's just all part of the fun. Moving on, I can tell you that longitudinal tension can also be reduced by the thyroarytenoid muscles. So this is a set of muscles which, as their name implies, connect the thyroid cartilage up here to the arytenoid cartilages back here. So we've got the vocal folds themselves down lower, connecting up with this horn or point of the arytenoid cartilages. And you can contract or relax that muscle there as well. And then there's another set of muscles at the higher horns of the arytenoid cartilages, which can pull this whole structure forward or let it slide back as well. So if you contract these muscles, it's going to have kind of a knock-on effect on the tension in the vocal folds themselves. Yeah, and interestingly, well, I've always assumed that these muscles are not something you can sort of stick a needle in when you're talking, although actually, since I made up these slides, I have seen papers which report data of that nature. I'm not really sure how they did that. Maybe it involved a tracheotomy as well. I don't know. So it might be possible, but again, I don't want to participate in that experiment either. Yeah, but the main thing to think about is there are muscles here which can also affect your F0, even though they're not directly a part of the vocal folds themselves. Okay, so let's look at some pitch shifting videos. How does this actually work in action? Yeah, so we'll do this one, which is a little bit less or lower quality video. It's from about 40 years ago. Yeah. Yeah, and so the main moral of this story is that when you stretch them out, when you increase the intention on your vocal folds, F0 goes up, and you can hear that nice and easily. How much fun is that? We do that all the time, every day when we speak. We just didn't know it until now. So this is another video where the quality is a lot higher, so you can see this in all its glory, and for that reason it may be a little bit grosser, but hopefully it will get the message across. All right, how much fun is that? Okay, so I'll play it again with the volume a little bit higher. So I'll point out a few structures here. So this thing sitting in front, this big arch, is the epiglottis. So it's not really technically part of the larynx, but it's pretty close. That's the thing that kind of folds back down so that food doesn't go through, or drink doesn't go down into your trachea when you're swallowing something, which is important because you don't want to just choke to death every time you eat. Also, just generally speaking, you can see the vocal folds nice and clearly here, and like I said, they kind of have this pale white-gray color to them because that's the color that ligaments have in your body. There's not as much blood flowing through them, basically, as there is in other membranous structures around here. So this point is where they come together when they're attaching to the thyroid. This is the front of the speaker's body. The arytenoid cartilages are sitting under here. And once she kind of takes a big breath here, you can see the rings of the trachea leading down to her lungs. But I'll play the whole thing again. Actually, I'm going to stop here for a second and point out that hopefully you recall, maybe you don't, it's all right if you don't, that the average F0 for adult female speakers tends to be about 200, 220 hertz. That's 200 vibrations or repetitions of the cycle per second, right? Normally, video is shot at about 30 frames per second. So that's sort of like going back to our discussion of sampling at the beginning of the semester, when you shoot a video, you don't shoot something like continuous. You don't capture all the changes in the visual domain that are out there. You just take a still picture 30 times a second. You take 30 samples of the visual world per second, and then you string them together, and it appears to be like continuous motion. Phenomena like this, which are happening at a very fast rate, kind of blow the lid on that sort of illusion, because the vocal folds are opening and closing 200 times a second, and you're taking a picture every like 1/30th of a second. So the vocal folds will open and close about 6 or 7 times in between each frame of the video. So you're not going to get a nice clear picture of them opening and closing or being in any one position at all. You're going to get the sort of average of them being open and closed during that time 7 times over 1/30th of a second, which is why this is a blur here in the middle. It is possible to shoot video at a higher rate than that. I actually have a camera in the lab which shoots, I can't remember, maybe up to 1,000 frames per second, but I haven't used it for this purpose because I'm not into the fibroscopy thing. But I just wanted you to recall that or know that, which in part to explain why this looks like that, but also to remind you of what sampling rates are all about. So I'm going to start back at the beginning and walk you through the video again. Yeah, so there's this beautiful little spot here at the tail end where you can see down into her trachea, and these are the tracheal rings. Isn't that disturbingly cool? There's also kind of a nice spot here where you can see that she's basically making contact with the ligaments here. There is still a little gap here in between the cartilaginous glottis. And since she's pumping air out of her lungs, air can still kind of flow through that little spot to give it sort of basically a more breathy quality of phonation than you might have otherwise. And the vocal folds just get longer and more tense as she goes up to the top end of her F0 range. Yep. Alrighty. So I think we've seen enough of that. What else? What other consequences does this sort of action or set of actions have? Increasing longitudinal tension also not only makes the vocal folds longer, but makes them thinner because they are more tense. So the vocal folds, when they are thinner, are going to open and close more quickly because basically there is less surface area contact between the two vocal folds in the middle. So it's kind of easier to pull those apart than it is a set of thicker vocal folds. And it's also easier to kind of bring them back together so that they touch. Basically, the Bernoulli effect is going to be the same amount of force sucking the two sides back in together, regardless of how big those two structures are. So because the same amount of force and has kind of less mass to deal with down here, it brings them back together more quickly, which is basically why you're getting higher F0 here. Easier to pull apart, easier to bring back together than thicker vocal folds like this. I'll just point out some basic stats. The average thickness of male vocal folds is about 2 to 5 millimeters. So that's like 1/10 to 2/10 of an inch. And then female folds are going to be somewhat thinner than that by default. So that also helps explain why female F0 tends to be a bit higher than male F0. Also point out, this is an artifact from the mystery tone language exercise, which used to be a part of 441, then I switched it to be part of 341. So hopefully you recall this at least a little bit, but if you're, well, yeah, the way that was supposed to work is that you were listening to tones from some mystery language that you had never heard of before, and then you're supposed to identify what the distinctive tones were in it, and they came in different word forms. An older version of this mystery tone language exercise used, I think it was the language Amoy, which is also from southern China somewhere, and it had a male speaker. The recordings I had were not the highest quality though, so I got rid of it eventually, but I'll play a couple of those recordings for you now. This is this speaker of Amoy trying to produce the same tone on the vowel A versus the vowel E. Ga, si. So that's supposed to be the same tone in the abstract linguistic level, but I think you can hear this pretty well that this F0 is higher than this F0. Ga, Right, so this one's right around 200 hertz. This one is a little bit below 200 hertz. And I'll add again that keep talking about like males typically have an average F0 of like 120 hertz. Females have an average F0 of more like 220 hertz. But obviously, males can get higher and lower in their F0 range if they want to. So this guy is more or less at the top end of his range. This is like a high level tone. So he's around 200 hertz, which is more typical for female speakers. The funny thing about this, though, the reason I'm mentioning it, is that the fundamental frequency is higher for this vowel than it is for ah. Why would that be the case? It's been observed generally that F0 tends to be higher for high vowels than it is for low vowels. So E, this is from an old study done about 60 years ago from American English. So high vowels like E and U on average will have F0 of like about 180 hertz. Mid vowels like O and A will be around 170. And then ah and ah, low vowels will be more like 160 hertz. And this is a phenomenon which is referred to as intrinsic pitch. So intrinsically, some vowels will just have higher F0 than others. Why is that the case? I often let people puzzle over that question for a while in class as well. You can maybe think about it yourself if you want to, or I can just give you the answer right now. So this is one hypothesis for why this is occurring. It's called the tongue pull hypothesis. And this is from a study done back in 2004. So the idea is that this is the larynx. So it's got the hyoid, thyroid cartilage, and cricoid cartilage labeled here. And this is where it sits for a high vowel, like oo, versus ah, which is a little bit lower, and you're retracting your jaw. And so the kind of trick here is, remember, to get a higher F0, you want to lengthen and stretch out your vocal folds, and get a lower F0, you shorten them and loosen them up a bit. So there is a structure. This is the kind of upper reaches of your spine here. And there is a bit of a bend in this region of your spine that's basically in your neck. And as the vocal folds kind of traverse the curve of that spine, if they go around it like this, they got to kind of stretch out a bit more in order to sort of navigate that geometry. So this is the dotted line is trying to show you what the vocal folds look like in the higher position, and the solid line shows you what they look like in the lower position. So the idea is that when you raise your tongue for high vowels, it's going to raise your larynx around this bend, and then if the cricoid cartilage itself will rise up around the spine, and that's going to stretch out the vocal folds and increase longitudinal tension passively, basically. So when they're stretched out like they are here in the dashed line representation, that's the only way you can kind of stretch them to get around that bend. And they're going to have a higher F0 kind of by default, even if you're targeting basically the same tone or pitch in your mind. And if it's in a lower position, it doesn't have to stretch out that much. So you get a shorter set of vocal folds and a slacker set of vocal folds to give you a lower F0. Yeah, that's a lot of detail to explain this, but that's just sort of so you know. And where this kind of winds up having an effect on language is that there's 3 sets of intrinsic properties that vowels have. So high vowels will tend to have less intensity than low vowels. If you open up your mouth a lot for a low vowel, there's just more air coming out. There's more room for the air to get out, and so that's going to give you more intensity. If you produce a low vowel, it takes you a little bit longer to get your vowel down to the target than it does for a high vowel like E. So because it takes a little bit longer, low vowels will tend to be longer than high vowels. And then for F0, we get a pattern where the high vowels tend to be higher because of this fact I just mentioned a second ago than low vowels. And the funny thing about this is that all these factors will factor into perceived prominence and stress. So intensity, duration, and F0. And generally speaking, more intensity and longer duration will give you a percept of greater prominence or stress. So the low vowels have the advantage there. But higher F0 tends to give you a percept of more prominence as well. So the high vowels have an advantage there. So as usual, stress is pretty complicated, especially at the phonetic level, but you kind of have to take all these things into consideration when you're trying to perceive whether a syllable or a vowel is stressed. You have to consider what vowel is actually being stressed. And I guess I'll mention, so low vowels kind of have an advantage of 2 to 1 here. Low vowels, generally speaking, are considered to be more sonorous or more inherently loud than high vowels in the phonological world. Okay, I've said a lot for this second part of this lecture, so I'm going to stop now, and then I'm going to wrap it up talking about the other forces that get involved in changing the rate or the way in which the vocal folds vibrate in the next part of this lecture. So I'll see you then in just a second.